Welcome, folks. Good as always to see so many of you. Welcome. This evening we are going to be in discussion with Georgina Rush about two of the courses that she is going to be running with us on the 18th and 19th of May on the issue of sexual orientation, and also a second one the day after on sexual health. They're both running between 12 and 2. So they are lunchtime events, which are part of our certificate in integrated CBT for adolescents. I just want to emphasize, like all of our bite-sized events, they tend to be packed with information, basically. It's one of the things that we've been trying out over the last year is to mix our events to some degree so that we're not simply running whole day events with the risk of Zoom fatigue, but we're also trying to give you an opportunity of shorter, more condensed events as well, where we try and pack those with as much information as possible. So if I can just start off by saying a little bit about what's actually coming up on SDS. I'll just share my screen. You can bear with us a moment. So we've obviously, as you've probably already guessed, got quite a busy time here in May this year. So let me just take you through to the courses that Georgina will be running. Again, gone into the, if I can actually see here, my spelling's okay. Yeah, so looking here at the two courses that Georgina is running. This particular one on sexual orientation development and supporting young people through that particular process. That, as I say, is occurring in 12 days' time on the 18th of May between 12 and 2 o'clock. And if I can just go back and search for the second one, which will be occurring the day after, again on working with adolescents on sexual, why is sexual health, because I didn't spell health correctly. Why is sexual health not appearing? There we go. Which is the day after, again running between 2 and midday. As you probably already spotted on my screen share, there is still a super early bird discount on both of these prices, but it does expire at midnight tonight. But having said that, there is a further discount if you actually book both courses together. So they're obviously on sequential days, both between 12 and 2 o'clock, and there is a further discount. So I think the whole thing ends up reducing from a basic price of something like about 160 down to 110 for both courses combined. So if you want to grab that again, can I just emphasize, folks, is something which is going to expire at midnight tonight. No ifs and buts on that, I'm afraid, but there is obviously time during this particular course and afterwards for you to actually book onto that. So lots of interesting things happening. What I wanted to do was to move on, however, quite specifically to these two courses which Georgina is going to be running. A number of you will already be familiar with Georgina because Georgina has been involved in our course on gender dysphoria and adolescence. But for those of you that haven't worked with her before or are not familiar with her, she's a BABCP accredited CBT therapist. I think I'm right in saying, I was actually thinking to myself earlier on today, Georgina, that I'm just trying to think of where to describe your base. Are you actually based for your work in Lancashire? Is that Yeah, that's great. Okay, a quick nod there. So Georgina's based in Lancashire. So she works as I say, a BABCP accredited CBT therapist. She's also a lecturer at the GMMH Psychological Therapies Training Centre and a senior mental health practitioner in the CAMS service there. What can I say apart from welcome and thanks for being with us this evening, Georgina.
Thank you.
I wanted to sort of just explore a few things in connection with the course, really, because I guess that particularly if this is not something which is either in the forefront of people's work with adolescents, in other words, if people are used to working with other types of problem, or alternatively, it's not something that they come across very frequently. I guess I was sort of interested in starting off by just really sort of asking you a basic question, which is, on your sexual orientation course, what in your experience are some of the most common issues that tend to crop up for young people?
Yeah, so I guess for the purpose of thinking about sexual orientation and kind of the development side of it, the course, and I guess kind of a lot of what I'll be talking about, sits with people who are part of the LGBTQ community, mainly because those are the young people, the adolescents that appear to be impacted or affected in terms of, I guess, outside experiences or other experiences in related to their sexual orientation and sexual identity as such. So I guess for tonight, if I make references to things like that, that's kind of the community or the population of young people that I'm holding in mind. But that equally doesn't mean that people who identify as heterosexual don't experience issues or difficulties either as well. But in terms of some of the things that we'll be thinking about on the course, but also my practice working with adolescents in camp services and in schools, it's similar, I think, to a lot of the difficulties that you would expect adolescents to experience, but actually there are additional things on top of that. So we know that adolescents tend to have difficulties with, say, relationships with family or kind of particularly parents as they're developing in the adolescent stage, but also issues with peers and kind of educational attainment. But when you're thinking about adolescents who identify as lesbian or gay or even bisexual, I guess they face additional stresses due to their sexual orientation. So they're more at risk of bullying and even hate crimes and kind of more victimization within school, within wider kind of scenarios or kind of different environments. There's also experiences of rejection from family and experiences of rejection from peers or kind of existing friendship groups. And I also think about in terms of kind of that identity development as a whole. So we might notice that young people engage in more risk-taking behaviour. So when we think about sexual identity, and I guess obviously this kind of blurs into a bit of that sexual health stuff that I know we're probably going to talk about a bit later on, but some of that kind of sexual expression. And you might notice that adolescents as a whole, not just specific communities or minorities within that grouping, might engage in some more risk-taking behaviour as part of that expression. And so that can create some difficulties and problems as well. And I guess on top of all that, children, adolescents who identify in LGBTQ communities or identify in that kind of sexual orientation category are at greater risk, or there's more prevalence of self-harm, anxiety disorders and depression as well. So obviously there'll be a large component on that, thinking how we could link that into some of those CBT processes as well.
Okay, well, that's sort of quite interesting. I mean, if I can just ask you a sort of follow-up from that, really, because it's interesting. So, and this probably illustrates my ignorance more than anything else, but so it would not be unusual to have clients who have these particular issues, but also identify themselves as being part of that community. Is that fair to say? So it's not something, I mean, I'm sure this must crop up, but it's not so common for individuals to see themselves, for example, in total isolation or to see themselves as being the only one. it's much more common to be able to identify with being part of a community. Is that the case?
I guess that's a mixed response, or I can give you kind of a mixed answer to that in some ways. And that actually, I think adolescents that I work with now, there's so much in terms of social media access and kind of promotion, and some fantastic role models out there in the world of kind of TikTok and
Right.
Instagram, that actually, you know, people do develop a sense of belonging. But I think typically with all adolescents, their experiences seem to be kind of felt just as a solo person, or kind of it's only them that's going through that. And I think if you're part of a friendship group where sexuality or sexual identity or orientation isn't discussed, or part of a family where kind of that isn't discussed or is even frowned upon, you're at risk then of kind of increased isolation.
Right. Okay. So there is something of a mix there. I'm going to come back to the issue of sexual orientation in a minute. If I can just move briefly onto the other course that you're running on sexual health. I guess that one of the things again that I was sort of quite interested in over the issue of sexual health is that, does that tend to be the primary issue that one's looking at? And when one does look at it as a primary issue, is the work that you do primarily about prevention, or is there other work or other issues basically that need to be looked at as well? Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for me, prevention fits with a typical kind of health related model when we think about sexual health. So thinking about prevention of people kind of in terms of unwanted pregnancy or STIs, and I guess that kind of preventative thing. But for me, sexual health is more like an umbrella term, and there are so many things that fall underneath that I think traditionally haven't been considered. So when I kind of think back to the sexual education that I might have got in school compared to kind of what I know now as an adult from kind of my work experience, actually that was kind of limited. So the things that I consider to be important when we're thinking about sexual health as an umbrella term, I guess there are lots of things that fall into that, but some of the main ones for me are kind of issues around consent and kind of understanding that in terms of helping adolescents and young people think about what that actually means fully. And so is it consent, is it coercion, is it compliance? And so thinking about some experiences that they might have had and kind of almost processing that. So young people that I've worked with recently, specifically teenage girls who kind of say, actually, I didn't want to do something, but I did do it. And I guess then the repercussions of that for them. Also,
yeah, sorry
go on. No, you go on.
Carry on.
I was going to say another thing for me is about, in terms of sexual health, is relationships, and kind of understanding about healthy relationships and what sexual health looks like within that relationship, and how we might consider safe sex and safe sexual practice as part of that relationship, but actually is that relationship safe in the first place in terms of kind of engaging in sexual activity? And then, yeah, sorry, I was going to say another thing.
No, carry on. I just find it fascinating. Please carry on.
Yeah, and then I guess another thing that I am quite conscious of, I'll think about, is kind of that media aspect and what young people are accessing. So I've already mentioned about TikTok and Instagram, and we know that, you know, social media is kind of a big presence and is really out there. But actually one of the other things is kind of the internet, and as great as Google is for, you know, giving me the answer for everything that I need, it's also kind of quite dangerous, I guess, for young children and for even adolescents in terms of what they might access with regards to pornography. And I guess that in itself brings in a whole raft of kind of assumptions or attitudes about sex and about sexual activity and what it should look like, or how as a teenage girl they should perform, or kind of body comparisons. And again, in terms of males and teenage boys, about what sexual kind of relations or encounters look like. And actually for me, I guess sexual health, although it's important to think about, you know, kind of like pregnancy and STIs, it's also important to consider other elements that fall under that umbrella in order for adolescents to make informed choices. And I guess that's the thing about an adolescent brain, is that we know in terms of that developmental stage, sometimes they can struggle with kind of rational decision making, and might do things that we think, why have you done that? That doesn't even make sense to me. But I think if, as kind of a group of professionals and a team of professionals, we can consider sexual health as an umbrella term and the things that might come with that, we can help young people to make informed choices.
Right. Okay. There's so much material there. There's so much material there. Let's just zero in on maybe one particular area, just so I can get a clearer idea about the interface between this and, for example, CBT. Yeah. So if we look at the issue of consent, for instance, I mean, presumably some folks that you work with must have certain beliefs which contribute, at least in part, to some of the problems that they actually have. Well, I mean, what sort of things are we talking about that people often find that they do believe at in this particular age group, which do play a role in the difficulties that they might be experiencing or the risks that they might come across? Yeah.
So I guess in terms of kind of consent, I guess it's a really large subject, isn't it? Or it's a really large topic to kind of fit into this little snippet tonight. But thinking about kind of teenage thoughts, processes, or assumptions, or beliefs around kind of sexual activity, there is a lot in there about kind of wanting to kind of do things so that the relationship works out, or wanting to engage in sexual activity because they're worried about the consequences if not, or kind of wanting to fit in. And if it's spoken about in kind of friendship groups, then am I the odd one out because I'm not doing it, or what, that kind of, I guess, those kind of conversations. And so actually, I guess what I kind of come across quite a lot in practice is adolescents who go along with engaging in sexual activity because they feel like it's the right thing to do, not because it's what they want to do. And so I guess with that comes kind of some beliefs about themselves and kind of some negative thoughts, but also, feelings of shame and guilt and embarrassment.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, a couple of things that you mentioned there are presumably fears about what might happen, I guess, in terms of romantic or sexual rejection. And so have I got that right? There's also beliefs here which are maintained by basically the rest of the young person's peer group. Does that also play a role?
Yeah, so I think when we think about adolescent belief systems and networks and compare it to adults, so as adults we've had kind of, lots of life experiences as well as information gathering and kind of different relationships. And I'm not talking about sexual relationships, but kind of ones with other professionals, with family, with friends, that kind of help shape our belief system. But actually adolescents kind of focus on, a couple of areas. So parents, peers, and then kind of information gathering, which usually comes from kind of media sources, internet, social media, and that kind of thing. And so actually, if you have kind of parents who don't speak about sexual health or kind of sexuality, you might then kind of find yourself getting information or kind of sharing things with peers that kind of then shape what you think about sex or sexual health.
Right. Okay. And presumably, from the sound of it, it's not uncommon for parents not to have that sort of discussion with their son or daughter. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's one of those subjects, as is a lot, really, isn't it? When you kind of have children, there are certain subjects that you feel like I don't know how to talk about it, or I don't know what to say in a way that is comfortable for me based on my belief system and what I think about this activity, but also in a way that is going to be helpful. So it can be something that some people might shy away from, or it can be that people tend to go down that kind of more kind of prevention route where you're thinking about contraception and kind of that safe sex element. But interestingly, a while ago, I read some research, and it's relatively old, and in terms of like generalizability and all that kind of thing, it's lacking in some key areas. But it kind of said that children of parents who go down kind of more of a STI chat and a safe sex kind of conversation tend to be sexually active, whereas parents of children who don't have those kind of conversations and think more about consent and healthy relationships, tend to kind of be less sexually active, because they're kind of trying to find somebody where the relationship might have longevity, or they're thinking about kind of making those choices. So for me, I guess pulling those two together feels quite important.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So in a way, the context in which this is talked about seems to make quite a big impact on behavior, in fact. That's right, that's interesting. I suppose the other thing that sort of crosses my mind as I'm sitting here is my own thoughts, many years ago when I was that age, thinking to myself, why the hell can't my parents just get it in terms of how to talk about this, or why won't they talk about things? And I would never be someone that would be in that particular position. And I'm sure what's really, really interesting is so many adults find their position somewhere or other changes when they're actually thinking about whether or how to actually have this conversation with a young person. I guess that, coming back to the question of where CBT fits into this, for a lot of people, I suspect that CBT isn't the first thing that comes to mind when looking at the question of sexual orientation. Can you just say a little bit about what you'll be saying specifically about CBT and sexual orientation on the 18th of May?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for me, when we're thinking about kind of CBT and sexual orientation, it's more about how can we use CBT approaches and informed practice to support with some of the issues that might arise with an adolescent who is kind of talking about their sexual orientation and some of the experiences that they might have. So for example, I guess again, drawing from recent practice, a young person who was in an all-faith school, an Islamic faith school, where kind of sexuality was not openly spoken about, was really kind of struggling, and was thinking the kind of, I guess, the information that you get from referrals is anxiety or low mood, but actually there's something there, isn't there, about unpicking some of that and thinking about how can I support this young person. And so although we'll be looking at, I guess, kind of different things in terms of that transdiagnostic approach and looking at change methods, kind of drawing bits from kind of a bit of anxiety work, a bit of low mood work, there's also something about key considerations for us as practitioners in how we might approach some of this. So thinking of ways that we might speak about kind of opening up that conversation. And I guess, like you said there, Paul, it's not always easy as adults to even have that conversation. And also, like, our own reflections of when we were adolescents, there's almost that like, oh, this is cringe, my mum might be trying to talk to me about this and this is really uncomfortable. But actually, as kind of practitioners, how do we approach that and thinking together about that, but also thinking about those young people who, because of the environments that they're in or their experiences, can't really be their true selves. And so with that, they might have some kind of negative thoughts about themselves, or kind of feelings of like shame and guilt for being the person that they are. And so we might want to draw on some of kind of that third wave CBT, thinking about ACT and kind of, being more compassion focused. Because actually we know that we can't change sexual orientation, we can accept it, and actually it might help that adolescent feel a little bit better in their own skin, knowing that even though they can't be outwardly true to themselves because of the environment that they're in, they can actually just kind of acknowledge it and spend less energy focusing on kind of the negative emotions that arise from that.
Yeah, that whole issue about acceptance is such a crucial one, and I think so difficult for many people, and obviously by definition, particularly if you're confronted by something so integral to your identity as, for example, sexual orientation to a young person, and they're trying to explore that and come to some sort of position on it. It's a really key skill, really, I think, isn't it, that people need to actually learn. In terms of, you know, we can obviously see a lot of problems that are actually around for young people in these two areas. I just really sort of wanted to ask you though, that if you had a magic wand and you could change any one thing in society, I know this is I'm only the one, unfortunately. Any one thing in society to address questions around sexual orientation or sexual health. What would that, you know, what would that one thing be that you maybe you say to yourself, oh my goodness, if only such and such was the case, or if we could have so and so, then it would have such a positive rippling out effect. What would be the one thing that would strike you the most in terms of that particular area or those particular areas?
Paul, you know me very well, and you know that there's never just one thing. So I'm going to try my hardest here and think about. Okay, so I guess my one thing, and the thing that I think is kind of key to everything, is an element of education. And so I'm not talking kind of traditional schooling, that thing, but I'm just kind of thinking about education that's accessible for all. So parents can access resources to help them have some of these conversations with their children. You know, professionals, we can access things. We can, you know, school kind of changing the whole way that I guess sexual identity, orientation, and sexual health is kind of spoken about in a school environment to help people kind of figure out and understand it. And I guess one of the things that I think is really kind of key as part of that is if your child is old enough to ask you the question, then they're old enough to receive a response. And so obviously we would kind of think about that in terms of what that response might look like. And I'm not saying if a 7-year-old asks you about sex, we're going to kind of go into full detail, but we might think about actually how do we answer that in a way that we're not kind of saying, oh, we don't talk about that, or, you know, that's kind of creates beliefs of shame, or we kind of brush it under the carpet. So at a later date, when that adolescent is questioning things or kind of wants someone to talk to, they feel like they can talk to a parent or trusted adult.
So, I mean, have I got you right here that basically what you're saying is that there is either a lack of helpful information in the field, or if it exists, people just don't know about it. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I would say so. I think kind of there isn't a specific conversation, isn't that people have with parents about this kind of thing, and there isn't enough, I don't think, out there. And I know it's in progress in terms of PSHE development in schools and kind of whole school approach, but there isn't a lot of kind of sense making or time given to adolescents from my perspective, apart from specialist services. So I think, you know, Brooke is in the kind of the sexual health services and other places like that. But actually, if as a society there was more kind of conversation or chatter about it over time, I guess my expectation or hope or wishful thinking would be that actually these kind of conversations are normalised. And I'm quite wary that this answer focuses a lot really on this sexual health aspect because I was only allowed one thing.
Okay, well, no. I do take the point. I'm feeling extremely generous this evening, and we'll offer you. I will offer you a second magic wand wish if you wish for it. Is there something? It sounds like there might be something else that you would feel is really quite useful to try and change if you had the power.
Yeah, I think for me, in terms of like looking at sexual orientation and development, you know, as a society, we've got a long ways to go, haven't we, in terms of that keyword that we mentioned before about acceptance. And so I don't have a solution or a magical way of thinking or an idea, but I guess one of the things that I would hope for, and I'm not going to get this tomorrow, but is for people to be more accepting and kind of tolerant, but also, again, you know, that conversations to be had around sexual orientation. And I remember, similar to you when I was younger, about kind of conversations that I might have had, and I didn't know as a child about other sexualities or sexual orientation. And it's only then as a teenager where you hear things that you learn about that. But actually, if that was kind of spoken about openly or felt a bit more accepted in society, then we might not kind of have some of the difficulties, or young people or adolescents might not feel so kind of isolated or struggle with things later on.
Right. So in a peculiar way, I mean, I don't know if peculiar is the right word, but in a way, as part of a general acceptance or greater acceptance of diversity, that would in itself just make a big difference to this. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's probably a bit of like wishful thinking on my part, isn't it? That actually that would make a massive difference. But I think if you come across less kind of prejudice, less exclusion, less hate crime, less bullying, because people are more accepting, surely that's got to have quite a positive impact on other people's kind of well-being.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, certainly from my perspective, I just think that this is one of those areas which it raises so many interesting questions, really. I don't know if there's anybody here that wants to either specifically ask you in connection with this, or alternatively to raise their hands. Or put it into the chat box what you'd like to ask Georgina about this. I mean, it is such a large area, and we are only going to be spending a total of 4 hours on it. But if there is anything, please feel free, folks, to raise your hand if you would like to, or alternatively, as I say, to pop something into the chat box. See, there's all these shy adults who are shy about talking about the issue of sex orientation.
Yeah, it's you know, it's one of those things, isn't it? I think that, like we've kind of discovered, even reflecting on our own kind of experiences, it is a tricky kind of topic to even just ask a question about or speak about. And again, it's one of those things that I think like people don't want to get wrong.
Yeah.
Or kind of, if you ask, you don't want to ask it in a wrong way, do you? But I just kind of think, let's just go for it.
Well, we've got someone here who is happily willing to sort of stick their neck out of it. So, Christina, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yes, hi everyone. Hi, Georgina and Paul. I was wondering, it's something I'm thinking of developing, is looking at the beauty of the body and how we care for ourselves. And I think that might be something, if I could put that across to young people, just to increase awareness, perhaps, and the chance that they might be more interested in self-care, and how we live in cycles. It's quite obvious more with young girls because of our periods, but also, you know, we all do. We have day and night, we have the seasons, and there's a certain beauty in all that when you look at how the human body functions. So I'm wondering if that might be a useful approach. What do you think?
I think it sounds to me like you're kind of considering, or it sounds like a really positive way of thinking about the human body and thinking about kind of experiences. And for me, it sounds like having a conversation or having that as or starting that process of thinking about those kind of things is a great step in terms of people being able to openly talk about that with you and with, you know, with other people, with kind of parents and carers. And I think then you kind of are showing that you're more open to other kinds of conversations, which might involve, you know, disclosing sexual orientation or talking about kind of sexual experiences and sexual health. So I think that sounds like a really good idea.
It also, I think, as well, what strikes me is how both of these areas of sexual orientation and sexual health are very, very tied up with the idea of self-care. They are very tied up in that particular, of treating our bodies as valuable and also accepting who we actually are. And it's interesting that we are exposed so much, aren't we, to messages which are the exact opposite of that.
Yeah.
And I can see the logic of what you're saying there. Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah. Okay, folks, anything else at all that anybody wanted to raise this evening with Georgina? Yes, I can see a hand there. Sorry, I can't see your first name. Jenny. Yes, Jenny, if you'd like to unmute and
Yes.
fire away.
Yes, I'd like to ask Georgina a little bit about her experience of working with gender dysphoria with teenagers. Because you mentioned earlier on about how teenagers may have a certain sexual orientation, but it's something that will be acceptable in their community. And it sounded as though you were working with them very much to help them to come to terms with themselves and be comfortable with themselves, but not necessarily to be kind of outing themselves in that community. Did I get that right?
I think you've got to think, haven't you, about what feels safe for that young person. And so for me, in terms of kind of sexual orientation, or even with kind of young people who are transgender, one of the things that feels really important is to suss out what feels kind of safe for that young person, and what it is that they want to share. And so actually it might not be safe for them in that kind of environment that they're in to kind of speak about that, or they might not want to. But actually, I guess I don't actively encourage young people to make the steps to do that, because I want them to do it at their own pace and think about kind of when they feel ready to do that and what feels right for them.
Anything else specifically on this area? Yes, Debbie, if you'd like to unmute and fire away.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Georgina. Thank you for a lovely talk so far.
Hi, Debbie.
Georgina, I've got a situation with a 15-year-old teenage girl who, when she was 12 years old, unfortunately on social media accessed pornography. And this has, it's kind of more to do, she doesn't identify as being gay, lesbian, but it's really traumatized her in terms of her sexual health now. She's presenting with a lot of self-harming behaviors. She thinks she's a pedophile. She thinks she doesn't, she's shut down emotionally and sexually. And it was kind of what you had said earlier on about sometimes, the media is good in terms of helpful information. But in this way, it's actually that pornography has really traumatized her. And I'm using CBT skills, but I'm wondering if there is anything else that you can sort of give advice or guidance in terms of what happens when pornography, leads to, or exposure to pornography leads to this trauma around sexuality.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great point, Deb, because I guess that's one of the things that I am going to be thinking about, or we're going to be covering kind of when we kind of meet up in a couple of weeks. But actually there's a reason, isn't there, why pornography and pornographic content has got an age limit on it, or kind of an age range on it. And that for me is kind of it. Really, I'd prefer it to be a little bit older, because I think even at 18, are you able to process that, and thinking about at young minds accessing kind of images or videos or whatever of sexual activity, where actually for me it's about this, for your particular young person, even though it might be difficult, and I guess you can only gauge that, would be kind of understanding a little bit more about what was in that image or what it was that they saw, because it could be that they've accessed kind of violent pornography or different things like that. But I would be thinking about kind of using a trauma-informed or a trauma model, like a CBT trauma model for that kind of young person, if she's having flashbacks, or if there are things about that fit with kind of that trauma category. But there's something there, isn't there, about how that she has this kind of thought about being a paedophile. And so I would kind of want to be curious with her in terms of thinking about, what makes up a paedophile, what kind of category does that fall under, thinking a little about where she sits with kind of her sexualization, sexual activity, her orientation and that kind of stuff, and kind of sexual health, and figuring out, actually just slowly breaking down that, because accessing things, you know, that you don't want to access, that you've been kind of shared with, or somebody's shown you, doesn't kind of make that automatic assumption, does it, about that person? But it sounds like she's really struggling with that. And, you know, there are children that I've worked with in a similar situation who have kind of been exposed to pornography or kind of other images at quite a young age, and actually it can feel really frightening and really scary to see that and not know what that means or what that is about. I don't know if that helps you much, Debbie.
Thank you, Georgina. Enormously helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it also just fits in with something that Sharon's actually mentioned as well in the chat box about how this whole topic has sort of made her more aware about its connection with trauma and its impact potentially on young people. I'm going to be bringing things to a close now, folks, but can I just remind you, if you do want to get into a deeper dive on this, then we have got these two 2-hour events that are actually operating on the 18th and 19th of May, where you'll be able to explore this in a lot more detail, specifically with Georgina on this. Can I also remind you again that there is a super early bird discount which finishes at midnight tonight, for both the courses if you book them individually, and a further discount if you book them all together. But apart from that, I'd like to say thanks very much for joining us again. You take care, look after yourselves, and before we say goodbye to you, if you'd like to unmute and just say goodbye yourself, and look forward to seeing you again soon. You take care of yourself, folks.
Thank you so much, Paul and Georgina. Bye.
Bye.
Look after yourselves. Take care, folks. Take care. Look after yourselves.